Chapter 6. About 2 months had passed since the Grand Council of Galimar approved the proposal to build the Eden starship. The ship was truly awesome in its design and construction. When Eobach personally saw it for the first time, though, he was speechless. Centuries of planning had gone into it, and there wasn't a bolt, screw, or plasma emitter with which he wasn't intimately familiar. But when he climbed on board the real bridge for the first time, not the virtual reality one, it felt odd. Like putting on an old cloak that had been worn for years. It may be tattered here and there, but it was warm and familiar. Having the real bulkheads and structural panels under his feet was strangely comforting. There was nothing tattered about this ship, though. Everything about it was gleaming and new. It even had that new starship smell. Life support had been operational on main sections of the ship for the last week, so Eobach could now personally supervise some of the phases of construction. Before then, he had elected to stay aboard the massive Galimar space station in geosynchronous orbit around Galimar, stationed directly above Gasia headquarters. It was initially used to relay instructions to the builder robot team until the communications systems came online aboard the new starship. Up until recently, moving back and forth between the orbiting space dock and the ground would have been quite a chore. The relatively small amount of palominium Galimar had in its possession, which was going to be used in the propulsion units of the Eden mission starship, was temporarily being used to gracefully move the shuttles between ground stations and the ship. Once the last shuttle had lifted the last shipment of supplies and personnel from the ground, those same anti-gravity pods used in the shuttle would then be extracted and placed in their permanent locations in the starship. The only difference between the way the shuttle utilized the anti-gravity pods and the way the ship would use them is the ship would administer much more power to the pods than the shuttles, allowing the Eden starship to realize far greater speeds than its smaller cousins. Since palominium has such a high melting point, the pods can take the additional power. Chemistry 101 teaches that the more power you apply to a material, the more heat you generate. Before the discovery of palominium, it was thought that radnium, atomic number 74, had the highest melting point, 3,400 degrees. Palominium's is over twice that, so it can handle massive amounts of power being applied to it. It almost seems as if you could give it all the power you had, and it would just smile and ask for more. Basically, the dark matter engines on board the starship will generate massive amounts of power, and when that power is applied to the palominium pods, tremendous thrust will be achieved. Personnel had been transferring to the ship for the last week, but up until 2 days ago, most were engineers in charge of testing all the systems the builder robots had built. The bots were good, but there just wasn't anything that would replace the finesse of a good pair of hands. Several of the systems needed fine-tuning, especially the shield generators. Gasia was fortunate to have several doctorate students and professors from the University of Munde on hand for the completion and testing. Only last night had the generators come online, and the shield generator team was in the final phases of testing those systems. 2 days ago, families started arriving on board, and had begun the job of setting up the homes they would occupy for the next 20 years or so. They would be asleep for most of that time, but when they would be awake while orbiting around Eden, they needed to feel like they were at home, especially for the sake of the kids. The engines had been online for 5 weeks and had been supplying the necessary power for the completion of the ship. The builder robots had been dismantling the dock itself, and about 80% of the peak number of builder robots had been decommissioned and dismantled. That process was continuing, and if everything remained on schedule, the ship was going to be completed tomorrow. Krelon sat in a chair looking out into the deep reaches of space through the large floor-to-ceiling windows which adorned his stateroom. Below he could see the Galimarian planet he had called home for the last 6,000 years. But from this vantage point, looking at the stars was a simple matter of glancing up. and in doing so he was gifted with some of the most breathtaking vistas possible. From the ground, it was exceedingly rare to see all 5 moons orbiting around Galimar at the same time. From the Eden ship, it was a regular event. From the ground, the daytime sky appeared blue. From space, with the sky all around, it was the blackest of black, accented with an amazing peppering of stars and galaxies, some near, but most very far away. As Krelon considered the emptiness of space, he also contemplated the vast emptiness of his heart. One of the bigger and heretofore secret reasons why he had sought out Eobach to go on this voyage was his awareness that, while he had quite a bit of notoriety due to his accomplishments, his ability to find the perfect life mate for himself remained maddeningly lacking. Was he hoping to find a mate amongst the voyagers on this trip? Not really. Most passengers would be complete families. In fact, he was going to be one of the few single people on the ship. But the short period of 20 years for this voyage would end up being a little getaway for him, helping him to take his mind off the loneliness he had been feeling lately. Looking out his windows at the massive number of stars and galaxies, he wondered how love would ever come his way. Would he find her? He had a feeling she did exist, but where? Recently he had a conversation with his amulet companion Lorana about how unsuccessful he had been in finding love, and she made a suggestion that sounded about as good of an idea as any other. Lorana's idea was for Krelon to allow her to find the perfect mate, since he had failed in that task. He agreed. Her condition, though, was that he had to write a letter to the woman she might find, and when she was found, Lorana would direct her to that letter. It had to be a letter on paper, not on the computer, so nobody would know what it said except his eventual mate. Krelon knew it was something Lorana had him do to keep from being so despondent about this issue, to give him something to hope for. He didn't know where his future mate was, but somehow Krelon knew she was out there. He just had to find her. Krelon placed the letter, which was rolled up and tied with a red ribbon, in a hidden panel above the head of his bed. The existence of that hidden panel was only known by him, Lorana, and the robotic engineer who confidentially included it in Krelon's accommodations. As he thought about that letter, a tone came across the room indicating someone was at his door wishing to visit. Krelon responded with his standard invitation. "Come." The sliding door to his room was voice-activated, so that response was said not to the person on the outside of the door, but rather to the computer system designed to ensure comfort and convenience in the room. When Krelon said "come," that meant open the door, so it did. As Krelon looked toward the door, he saw the face of Eobach, who by this time had become quite a close friend. During the ship's construction, Eobach endeavored to make Krelon a key ingredient in all the efforts, events, and meetings concerning the engineering and building of the starship. It ended up being quite an education for Krelon, and through it all, the two men realized they had many common interests, as well as senses of humor that perfectly fit in with each other, much to the chagrin of Ruavu. She acted like it was a chore to deal with two men who thought so similarly, when, in reality, it was nothing less than a supreme pleasure to have Krelon around. He was very accommodating and gracious, as she dealt with her pregnancy during the last 2 months, and his top priority was to help in any way he could to make her comfortable. Without a doubt, he was a good role model for the kids, too, and spending time with them was something Eobach, Ruavu, and Krelon mutually found much pleasure in. Eobach walked into Krelon's room, and as soon as he cleared the threshold, the door closed automatically. Looking around, it seemed like Krelon had really done a good job of personalizing the apartment he now occupied. The floors were made to simulate a multi-hued blue marble, and at the other side of the room, there was what looked like a tree growing in the middle of the room, extending up to the second floor of his apartment. It wasn't a real tree, of course, but it sure did look like one. Encircling the tree was a spiral staircase that appeared to be suspended in air, but when you looked closer, you could see thin supports hanging from the ceiling. The view out the windows of Krelon's 50th floor apartment was amazing, not only because of floating in space, but also because of the view of the other buildings in the ship's central structure, which was built to look like a city with a ground level and buildings. This was on purpose, because once the ship landed on the oceans of Eden, it would be a familiar place to live while exploring a new planet. Looking up, you could see the 6 massive pylons that extended from the outer edges of the ring encircling the ship. The pylons curved in from the edge of the city, standing in guardianship over all below, their tips extending the equivalent of 200 stories above the ship's ground level. There were beacon lights slowly blinking on and off at the ends of each pylon, put there to indicate its operational readiness. Looking at Krelon, Eobach thought he would bring him up to speed on the latest status of the ship.
My friend, it looks like tomorrow evening's launch date is going to be on time and on schedule. The last of the builder robots are scheduled to decommission themselves tomorrow morning at the 9th hour, and from that point, we're on our own.
Krelon shook his head, contemplating the events of the last 2 months, and the sheer brute strength of the planning Eobach had done to lead to this moment.
You must be pretty proud of all you have accomplished here.
Eobach actually blushed.
I don't know. I mean, well, yes, I am proud of the ship, but it wasn't all me.
Krelon cocked his head and gave his friend a look that said volumes.
All right already,
relented Eobach.
I have been your sidekick for the last 2 months, and you have been relentless in seeing to it this ship was exactly what you designed. This is your ship, all right. You may have had some underlings handle some minutiae, but for all intents and purposes, they should call this ship the Eobach Express. I don't know about that, but it's actually what I came to talk to you about.
Oh? Asked Krelon.
Yeah. You see, tradition states the ship doesn't get its name until the day it is launched, which is tomorrow. There's going to be a ceremony on the main deck hangar to accommodate all the flight crew who will want to be there for the event, along with some members of the Grand Council.
Krelon interjected.
And I suppose you want me to be next to you at the ceremony, just like you had me be there for everything else you've done on the ship. You know you don't have to ask, my friend. I wouldn't miss it. I know, but actually there's something else I wanted to ask you concerning that ceremony. What's that?
Well, said Eobach,
I want you to know I recognize how important a role you played in that vote in the Grand Council chambers. I may have gotten it close, but you were the one who really turned that vote into the complete landslide it was. Since that's the case,
he paused,
I want to ask you to be the one to give this ship its name.
Krelon's eyes bugged out widely, and his head dropped 2 or 3 inches.
Are you kidding me? This ship is your baby. It is. But it's a baby that wouldn't have been born had it not been for you. Would you do that for me, pal?
Drawing in a deep breath, Krelon reverently replied,
It would be an honor, my friend. Thank you for giving me this privilege. Thank you for making it possible,
replied Eobach. The 2 men shared a moment of quiet contemplation. For his part, Eobach was mentally going over a checklist of things that still needed to be done, while Krelon was considering what name he would give to the ship. It took about 5 minutes of thinking, but as soon as he looked out over the vast expanse of this ship city, which sprawled out before him, the name he would give the ship became obvious. To him, the one he had chosen was perfect. Tomorrow, all would see that it was perfect too.
Well, my friend, Eobach intruded, I need to get to my quarters and bed down. My family is here now, and before I go to sleep, I'd like to spend some time with them.
Rising to his feet, Krelon extended his hand.
Tomorrow's a big day for sure. Sleep well and take care of that baby. Which one? The one born last week or its mother?
Mused
Eobach. Krelon laughed. Take your pick. The two men laughed as they approached the door. I'll see you at the 10th hour in Hangar 1, called out Eobach as he walked down the hall. I'll be there, answered Krelon. As he retreated from the doorpost, the door automatically closed, and Krelon returned to the chair he had been sitting in earlier. While sitting there, his eyes started to grow heavy. Lorana? Krelon said out loud.
Yes, Krelon,
came the answer from nowhere in particular. While home, he would place his amulet in the cradle on his desk, and in doing so, Lorana, a sentient yet synthetic life form, actually living in the amulet, became the voice of the home and the next best thing to having a living, breathing female by his side. It made the last 6,000 years of his life a little more bearable in the face of being so lonely. Please make sure I am awake in time for the ceremonies tomorrow.
Of course,
replied the omnipotent voice.
You know you didn't have to ask.
I know, he replied with a slight smile. Lorana was a good friend, and he couldn't imagine life without her.
Krelon?
Yes?
I was wondering if you have picked out a name for the ship, now that Eobach has asked you to name it. Is it a secret?
Krelon let out a slight chuckle. Not to you, my companion. I've decided to name her the Erigena. Lorana instantly saw the connection, and instantly felt the name was brilliant. She knew the significance would not be lost on anybody at the ceremony. Lorana turned on some very low music as Krelon drifted off to sleep, never moving from the very comfortable chair near the window. When she sensed he was completely asleep, she turned off the remainder of the lights and made sure all was quiet while her friend slept. Morning came to Krelon much quicker than he would have liked. After taking care of all customary morning ablutions, he arrived at Hangar 1 for the ceremony. The proceedings went according to plan, and when Krelon was asked to the temporary stage to say a few words, he said he had been asked by Eobach to name the ship. When he revealed the name, all stood in applause, showing the deeper significance of the name wasn't lost on them either. The hangar also doubled as a staging and storage room, as well as a launching bay for shuttles to come and go. One end of the hangar was completely open to space, and yet it had a special type of shield, finely tuned, to the specific particle vibrations of air molecules, allowing air to be kept in the hangar, while things like ships could easily pass through. As if the unending vista of space before them wasn't enough, Eobach had a small surprise in store for the attendees. Lords and ladies, I have a special treat for you, he said, taking the stage once Krelon's part of the program was finished. Looking toward the ceiling, he said rather enigmatically, Glendara, the word is given. Right when all present were beginning to wonder about the meaning of his words, Eobach's amulet companion Glendara, who was sitting in his cradle on the bridge, took control. Out the spaceport end of the hangar, the stars started to move. Within an instant, they all sped past, out of sight. The inertial dampening systems of the ship ensured nobody felt the slightest sense of movement. The scene out the port almost felt as if it was a movie being played on an entertainment vidscreen. My friends, Eobach said, I thought you might like to experience a short round-trip maiden voyage of the Erigena. He paused and glanced at his friend Krelon. One and all moved toward the spaceport to see a sight few would ever have the opportunity to view in their lifetimes. Laid out before them was the scene of heavenly bodies moving past them at ever-increasing speeds. Eobach had worked out with Glendara that this little jaunt was just going to be a short 5-minute spin around the solar system block. They would traverse distances that in past space exploration missions had taken months, even years, to complete. Now they would travel the same distance in 5 minutes. After a few minutes, Eobach sensed the apogee of the short voyage had been reached and spoke again.
and spoke up again.
Glendara, please report the status of the ship.
In a rather loud but not uncomfortable voice coming from all directions on the ship, Glendara responded,
Dark matter engines running at 10% capacity. Current speed is 0.037 of light speed. Life support fully functional. 6-level redundant shield generators running perfectly and operating at 20% of maximum. All other ship systems nominal.
Thank you, Glendara. Turning to those in the hangar, Aelbach continued, As you can see, my amulet companion is quite a capable acting captain of the ship while I'm not on the bridge. In fact, there are many ways he is better at it than I am, since he can talk to the ship personally and make decisions with split-second reaction times. He and Glendara had discussed all of this ahead of time, and it was his desire to instill confidence in Glendara's capabilities by this little demonstration. Following the script they had discussed, Glendara's booming voice spoke up again.
Reaching voyage apogee in 3, 2, 1, mark. Turning right for a return trip to Galimar.
Since the spaceport for this hangar was oriented towards the front of the ship, which was the main reason why Aelbach had selected this particular hangar in the first place, those who were gazing out the port were now treated to the breathtaking view of their planet, rushing up to greet them as the ship settled into orbit above.
Geosynchronous orbit established,
reported Glendara. Aelbach then simply said to the attendees,
This concludes today's ceremony.
There was a very obvious triumphant grin on his face. All broke out in deafening applause. Those within reach of him shook his hand or slapped him on the back. There was quite a lot of celebration and quite a bit of bubbly alcohol flowing. As the festivities were all centered around Aelbach, Krelon found himself looking out the port down onto the planet he called home. He gazed at the clouds forming over the bodies of water and examined the different colors of the land masses. From this vantage point, it was easy to see the areas that were well-watered and other areas more arid. He wasn't really concentrating on the geology of Galimar. His thoughts were elsewhere. Ruavu came up behind him. Holding her new baby in her arms, she quietly said his name, so as not to carelessly intrude. She needn't have worried about that. He was always happy to see Ruavu, and now that she was holding a new bundle of joy in her arms, he regarded her as a combination of beauty and grace personified. For Ruavu, his was a brotherly love which had no bounds, and he was always happy for her to tread in his life.
Ruavu, I didn't know if I would see you here for this. Are you doing okay?
I'm fine. It took a couple of days to get used to not being the size of a planet myself, motioning her head to the side of Galimar below. But I think I'm back in the swing of things. Of course, since this little one thinks I'm an all-you-can-eat buffet right now, my attentions are a little focused, shall we say? But I certainly wouldn't miss this. It's been the center of discussion at our dinner table for centuries.
Krelon laughed. I suppose it has.
He looked back to the sight before him, and Ruavu perceived something was on his mind. What is it?
Huh?
That look, Ruavu smiled. I've seen that look before. It says you're putting on a brave face, but something's troubling you. Krelon glanced at Ruavu with an incredulous look on his face.
How is it you have only known me for, a little more than 2 months, and you can somehow read me like a book?
Ruavu smiled. It's easy to do so when you're so transparent around Aelbach and me. Krelon silently snorted and slightly nodded his head.
I suppose I am.
He glanced out the port again. So, out with it. What's going on behind those deep dark eyes of yours? While staring out the port, Krelon dipped his eyes down in contemplation. After a few moments of thought, he replied, It's just that I have a feeling this is the last time I'm going to see Galimar.
Ugh,
grunted Ruavu, not liking the dire implication his words seemed to indicate.
"No, it's not like that," refined Krelon, looking back at her. "I know how that sounded, but even though I have those feelings, I also have the feeling we're all going to be all right. And somehow I'll find what I'm looking for."
Ruavu regarded her friend for a while, evaluating what he said alongside all of the many late-evening discussions she and her husband had with him. Krelon's desire to find a mate was a familiar subject to both of them, and in fact they had unsuccessfully tried to pair him with some of their acquaintances, all to no avail. None were a good personality match for Krelon, so in the end they decided he needed to do this at his own pace.
"I'm sure who you are looking for is somewhere out there in your future, and when she comes along, I look forward to being her friend, just as I enjoy being yours."
Krelon reached out to Ruavu and gave her a one-armed side hug, necessary since the little one was nursing. The two of them silently watched the incredible view, and before they knew it, the festivities had ceased, and Eobach was standing there. The three were each lost in their respective thoughts. Each knew they were at the end of a chapter in their life, but also knew the next chapter would, quite possibly, be the most memorable chapter of their own lifetime. They had no idea how right they were.